Why did home feel more dangerous than Afghanistan? That question kept replaying in my head the moment I stepped off that taxi in Charleston. The thick, humid air wrapped around me like a wet shroud, heavy and unwelcoming. I'd been through ambushes, black ops, and weeks of silence behind enemy lines, but nothing prepared me for the silence that waited at the end of my childhood street. My name is Maisie Wright, Sergeant, United States Army Special Forces. I've seen darkness before, out there in deserts where the sun turns sand into glass. But this was a different kind of darkness. Quieter, personal. It seeped through walls that used to hold family laughter. The house looked exactly as I remembered it, small, pale yellow, one-story, with its siding peeling near the gutters like sunburnt skin. The porch steps creaked when I stepped onto them, and I swear even the air smelled of decay. Cigarettes, mold, memories I'd buried a decade ago clawing back to life. I pushed open the groaning screen door and it hit me, the smell of dampness and stale smoke. That wasn't nostalgia. That was warning. Every instinct in my training told me to turn around, but duty, stubborn, relentless duty, made me step forward. Gerald was in his usual position, anchored into his worn armchair like part of the furniture. A baseball game flickered across the TV, painting his face in ghostly blue. He looked up once, not at me but through me. "You're here," he grunted. No warmth, no smile, just a fact spoken like an observation about the weather. The voice of a man who believed affection was weakness. "Bag in the corner," he added. "Don't clutter the place." From the couch, a voice I hadn't missed in years broke through the silence, a mocking, lazy drawl that made my stomach twist. "Well, look what the cat dragged in." Ethan, my stepbrother, the same smirk, the same cheap beard dangling from his fingers like a badge of honor. His eyes raked over me, my plain t-shirt, my army cargo pants, like I was wearing a clown suit. "You come home to play soldier again, Maisie." I didn't answer. The truth was I'd come home for my mother, Martha Wright, the only reason I hadn't cut ties completely. And right on cue, she hurried out from the kitchen, wiping her damp hands on that faded floral apron she'd worn since I was 10. "Maisie, honey, you're home." Her voice cracked halfway through, and when she wrapped her arms around me, I could feel the tension in her shoulders. Sharp bones, a body worn thin by years of walking on eggshells. Her hug was quick, frantic, almost apologetic. Her eyes darted toward Gerald, as if checking for permission to be affectionate. And when she whispered, "Welcome home," it sounded less like a greeting and more like a plea. Something was wrong. No, everything was. The night settled heavy, suffocating, and quiet. By dinner, the tension had a pulse. The table was small, the food familiar, mashed potatoes, green beans, roast beef, but everything tasted off. The air was thick with unspoken things. Gerald cleared his throat, the signal that meant everyone else stopped breathing. "So," he said slowly, "what they teach you in that army." He didn't look at me, he looked past me, like I wasn't really there. "Probably just to shoot guns and run around like a man." His words came out slow and deliberate. "In this house, we got rules, manners." He shoved the bowl of potatoes toward me, hard enough to make the ceramic scrape the wood. "Eat. Your mother cooked all afternoon." My training taught me to stay calm under fire, to recognize a trap when I saw one. I stared at the food, at his expectant eyes, and felt the familiar sting of defiance rising. But I forced a soft voice. "I'm not that hungry, thank you." Ethan laughed, loud, bitter, ugly. "Too good for home cooking now, huh? Guess you're used to that government chow." He took a loud, sloppy bite, chewing with his mouth open, eyes on me the whole time. It wasn't about the food. It never was. It was about control. And my silence made them furious. As I sat there, the smell of overcooked beans filling my nose, I thought of nights overseas. Sitting cross-legged with my unit in the dust, eating MREs that tasted like cardboard but somehow felt like a feast. Because out there, food was shared, earned, respected. Here it was ammunition. I looked up at my mother. She was quiet, eating mechanically, her fork trembling every few seconds. Gerald's stare pinned her down like a nail. I wondered how long she'd been living like this, how many quiet nights she'd spent calculating her next word like it might set off a mine. When I finally escaped to my old room, I expected some kind of peace, a pocket of the past, but even that had been taken from me. The room smelled of beer and sweat. Ethan's dirty clothes piled across the floor, empty cans lined on my dresser like trophies. A thick layer of dust covered everything that used to be mine. When I went to clear a spot for my duffel bag, I noticed my nightstand drawer half open. Inside, my old journals, photos rummaged through. My father's photo face down. A violation so personal it hit harder than any blow. I stormed back into the living room. Gerald didn't flinch when I said, "Someone was in my room." "I was looking for a screwdriver," he said flatly. "My house, my rules." His voice carried that tone of ownership, not just of the house, of us. The kind that makes you feel small, trapped. I swallowed the rage. Arguing would only feed him, so I turned and walked away. But that night I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark listening to them argue through the walls, their drunken voices bleeding into each other until they were just noise. The house felt like it was breathing, and I could feel it waiting for something to break. The next morning, I found Mom on the back porch. The air smelled of jasmine and rain-soaked earth. She was sitting in her rocking chair, eyes fixed on the overgrown yard where her rose bushes had died years ago. I sat next to her. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" "I'm fine, honey." Her voice was too quick, too careful. She reached for her glass of iced tea, and when she did, her sleeve slipped. That's when I saw it, a bruise, dark, deep, shaped like fingers. My throat went cold. "What happened?" She froze, then tugged the sleeve back down, trembling. "I fell." "Mom." "Maisie, please," she whispered, eyes wide, terrified. "Don't ask any more. Just pretend you didn't see it." Her voice cracked as she looked at me, begging now. "Your being here, it's already making him agitated. Don't add fuel to the fire." Her plea broke something in me. It wasn't just fear I heard. It was surrender. She wasn't protecting herself anymore. She was protecting him. She had chosen silence over survival. And in doing so, she left me alone on the battlefield. I sat there, watching the light fade across the yard, listening to the soft creak of her rocking chair, counting each sound like a second on a ticking bomb. That night, as I lay in the dark, I couldn't stop asking myself one question: where did this all begin? My mind, trained to trace threats to their origin, didn't have to search far. The memories flooded back like an ambush. Thanksgiving, years ago. The day I came home wearing my dress uniform for the first time. I remember how proud I was, the brass shining, my beret packed carefully in its case. I had gifts, real ones. A leather wallet for Gerald, a scarf for Mom, a new PlayStation for Ethan. I wanted them to be proud, to see me, to say, "You did good, Maisie." Instead, they turned that day into a public execution. Ethan, already drunk, raised his beer like a toast. "To our very own hero," he said. "The one who ran off to play soldier while I stayed and held down the fort." His friends laughed. Gerald smiled, a slow, poisonous smile, and stood beside him, hand on his shoulder. "The boy's right," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Men build the house, women make the home, and this one," he gestured at me, "don't seem to know which one she wants to be." Laughter. Cruel, muffled, embarrassed laughter. It spread like a virus. I stood there, frozen, my uniform suddenly feeling like a costume, a fraud. My greatest achievement turned into a punchline. I left that night without a word. The gifts I'd brought sat unopened by the trash. And when I found Ethan later, wearing my beret, parading around the kitchen while Mom smiled faintly, I felt something deep inside me go cold. He shoved me then, hard. "In this house you're nothing." That memory clung to me like smoke. That was the origin, the wound beneath all the others. Now, sitting in that same house years later, I finally understood it had never changed. They hadn't changed. They just waited for the chance to finish what they started. And yet a part of me still wanted peace, still wanted to believe that maybe, love could disarm hate. But the soldier in me knew better. A soldier knows when a mission is compromised. A soldier knows when it's time to prepare for war. Why do the quiet days always feel the most dangerous? In Afghanistan, silence meant one of two things, either safety or an ambush. And as I woke up that morning in my childhood home, I couldn't tell which one this was. The house was too quiet. No shouting, no TV, not even the hum of a ceiling fan. Just the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. I moved through the house like I was clearing a building, slow, controlled, alert. My mother was in the kitchen, her movements mechanical. She didn't look up when I said good morning. The bruises on her wrist were darker today. And Gerald, he wasn't there. The armchair was empty, the beer cans gone, but somehow his presence lingered, thick and heavy in the air. I poured myself coffee, the cheap kind they kept in a tin, and stood by the window, staring at the overgrown yard. The same yard where I'd learned to run as a kid. The same yard where my stepfather once threw my father's old army jacket into a burned barrel because we don't honor quitters in this house. Now that memory made sense. The hatred hadn't started with me. It had roots that went deep. By noon, the air outside felt like soup, thick, hot, and heavy with humidity. I couldn't stay inside any longer. My training told me to remove myself from hostile territory before I lost composure. So I grabbed my keys and stepped out, the screen door slamming shut behind me like punctuation at the end of a sentence I'd stopped wanting to read. Charleston was alive in a way that felt almost foreign. Tourists walked under live oaks draped with Spanish moss. The streets smelled of salt and sweet tea, and the ocean's breeze tried to remind me that life existed beyond that toxic little house. But even in the noise and sunlight, my body remained in combat mode, scanning faces, analyzing movements, searching for exits. Old habits, or maybe survival instincts, hard to tell the difference anymore. I stopped by a small convenience store, grabbed a bottle of water and stepped back into the sun. Across the street, a cafe spilled laughter onto the sidewalk. For a moment I envied the people there, ordinary strangers with ordinary problems. Their wars existed only in stories. Mine followed me everywhere. As I walked, I found myself on King Street, the city's beating heart, where pastel-colored houses stood shoulder to shoulder and shopkeepers called out friendly greetings. I took a sip of the sweet tea I'd bought on a whim. Gerald always said sweet tea was sugar water for fools. Maybe that's why it tasted like victory. And then the silence inside me cracked. It began with a sound, a sharp, ugly laugh that didn't belong in the sunshine. I turned, instinctively scanning. About 30 feet ahead, near a boutique's glass window, a scene unfolded that made my pulse quicken. An elderly man in a wheelchair wearing a faded Marine Corps cap sat quietly on the sidewalk. Around him, 3 young men, late 20s, shirts sticking to their backs, the stench of beer wafting even from where I stood. They weren't talking to him. They were taunting him. One of them leaned close, sneering. "What's that hat for, old man? Halloween ain't till October." The others laughed, loud, cruel. A kind of laughter I'd heard in interrogation rooms overseas, the sound of people who think no one's watching. But people were watching, that's what made it worse. A woman pushing a stroller glanced their way, then hurried off. A couple across the street pretended to admire a jewelry display. Dozens of eyes saw it and looked away. That's the thing about cruelty. It doesn't need a crowd to act, it needs a crowd to stay silent. Before I knew it, my body was already moving. My steps were automatic, controlled, a soldier's gait, no shouting, no scene, just presence. I closed the distance and stopped between the veteran and the ringleader. For a moment, no one spoke. I didn't raise my hands, didn't posture, just stood there, my shadow cutting the sunlight off his face. The young man smirked. "You got a problem, lady." I said nothing. I didn't have to. My eyes met his and went cold. The kind of cold that comes from knowing exactly how fast a body can fall. That look had saved my life more times than I could count. He faltered just a flicker. The smirk wavered. He puffed up his chest again, desperate to regain control. "Move it, bitch," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You have 3 seconds," I replied calmly, "to walk away with your friends before I make you regret staying." The tone wasn't angry, it wasn't loud. It was military cold, flat, absolute, and final. The kind of tone that ends fights before they start. He hesitated, looked to his buddies. They muttered something under their breath, and then, just like that, they left, muttering curses as they disappeared into the crowd that suddenly remembered how to breathe again. The silence they left behind was filled with the sound of the city coming back to life, the chatter, the footsteps, the rhythm. I turned to the old man. He looked up, his weathered face lit by gratitude. "You didn't have to do that," he said softly. I knelt slightly so I could look him in the eyes. "It was the right thing to do, sir." He nodded, a faint smile ghosting across his lips. Then, with quiet pride, he tapped the emblem on his cap, the eagle, globe, and anchor. "Marines." I tapped my chest in return. "Army, Special Forces." Something passed between us then, something wordless. A recognition, a bond that doesn't fade with age or branch or time. We both knew what it meant to carry ghosts. I walked him to his van, the heat rising off the asphalt in shimmering waves. Before he rolled up the ramp, he reached for my hand, gripping it tightly. "Thank you, soldier," he said. "They can take my legs, but they can't take our honor." The words hit me harder than any bullet ever could. Honor. That was what Gerald tried to crush, what Ethan mocked, what my mother's silence buried. This man, a stranger, had just handed it back to me. I nodded once, unable to speak. He returned the nod, a Marine's farewell, and drove off into traffic. I watched until his van disappeared, then exhaled the breath I didn't realize I was holding. For the first time in days, I felt alive again, seen, worth something. I went home that evening with his words echoing in my chest. Honor. It sounded different when spoken by someone who understood its price. But as soon as I pulled into the driveway, I knew that feeling wouldn't last. Ethan was sitting on the porch steps, a bottle of whiskey between his boots, his face half in shadow, eyes dark and glassy. He grinned when he saw me, but it wasn't a greeting. It was a promise. "Have a good walk, soldier," his voice slurred. "You're the talk of the town, you know. People saw you playing hero downtown." I froze halfway up the steps. "Go inside, Ethan." He chuckled, low and mean. "You think you're better than us, don't you? Always did." "Go inside," I repeated, quieter this time. He stood, swaying slightly, and stepped close enough that I could smell the sour liquor on his breath. "You embarrass this family every time you open your mouth. You think people respect you for wearing that uniform. They laugh at you, Maisie, just like we do." I felt the words hit, but didn't let them sink. Soldiers are trained to ignore psychological warfare, but nothing prepares you for when it comes from blood. I stepped past him without another word and opened the front door. The house was dark, too dark, and silent again. My mother's voice came from the hallway, small and trembling. "Maisie, please, just don't argue tonight." I wanted to ask her, how many nights had she said that? How many bruises had been hidden by those words? But I didn't. I just walked to my room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faint moonlight bleeding through the blinds. My arm still ached where his shoulder had brushed mine. My jaw clenched until it hurt. That night the nightmares came back, not of war but of laughter, of that Thanksgiving table, of my beret in Ethan's hands. When I woke it was 2:47, the house creaked. A television flickered somewhere. I sat there in the dark, feeling the pulse of the danger that still lingered in the walls. In the morning, it was worse. Gerald was waiting in the living room, calm as ever. He didn't look at me when I came down the stairs. "Heard you made a scene in town yesterday," he said. "I didn't make a scene, I stopped one." "Stopped one," he repeated, his voice flat. "That old man didn't need your help. People get themselves in trouble, they deal with it." "Is that what Mom did?" I asked before I could stop myself. His head turned slowly, and for the first time in my life I saw something behind his eyes, something colder than anger: calculation. He stood, taking one step closer. "You keep that mouth of yours running, girl, and you'll learn what real trouble looks like." My pulse didn't spike, my training wouldn't allow it, but inside something clicked, like a safety being flipped off. This wasn't home anymore. This was a combat zone, and the mission had changed. That evening the silence came again, but this time it wasn't uncertain. It was deliberate. There was no dinner for me. The table was cleared, plates washed, my place empty, like I never existed. Through the doorway I saw my mother standing by the counter, her eyes red, her lips pressed together. She didn't look at me. Gerald didn't either, but their message was clear. Exile. I sat in my room later, stomach growling, head pounding, feeling the edges of despair close in. And then through the window came a sound, a soft tap, then another. I turned, heart thudding. Someone was outside. When I pulled the blinds back, I saw a familiar face: Robert Hayes, the Marine from earlier that day. He was standing under the porch light, a thermos in his hand. "I got to thinking," he said quietly when I opened the window a crack. "Figured your good deed might have caused some trouble." He wasn't wrong. He held up the thermos. "My wife made chicken soup. She says there's nothing it can't fix." I took it through the window, my fingers shaking. "Thank you," I whispered. He nodded once. No questions, no pity, just understanding. And then he left, fading into the night. I sat on the floor, unscrewing the lid. Steam filled the room, warm, rich, and gentle. It smelled of care, of safety, of something I hadn't felt in years. I drank straight from the lid, tears falling before I even realized I was crying. It wasn't about the soup. It was about being seen, about someone, anyone, caring enough to show up. That night I slept for the first time in days. But deep down I knew this was just the calm before the storm, because men like Gerald don't let kindness go unanswered. And Ethan, he wasn't done yet. I could feel it in my bones. The quiet before an ambush. Why do the worst battles start with calm voices? The week after Robert Hayes handed me that thermos felt strangely peaceful, too peaceful. Gerald and Ethan had gone quiet, their tempers replaced by something colder. The silence in that house wasn't mercy. It was strategy. Every soldier knows this kind of quiet. The kind that hums under your skin, whispering that someone's moving pieces you can't yet see. I used the quiet to care for my mother. Every morning I made her tea, brushed her hair, read to her from the same weather-worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Sometimes, for a few fleeting minutes, she'd smile. But even her smiles came with apology, half hope, half fear. I tried to believe things were changing, that maybe the house was learning to breathe again. But a good soldier never trusts the quiet. Peace can be a decoy. It came on a Tuesday. Gerald called me into the living room. His voice was calm, too calm, the tone a commander uses right before signing orders. When I entered, Ethan sat on the couch, nursing a hangover. Gerald's posture was perfect. Back straight, fingers steepled, a mock imitation of control. "Sit down, Maisie," he said, gesturing toward the chair opposite him. I stayed standing. He sighed, pretending disappointment. "It's about Ethan." The name alone made my stomach tighten. What about him? Gerald began his story, a masterpiece of manipulation, rehearsed and polished. Ethan, he claimed, had started a small landscaping business last year, Something about bad clients, unpaid invoices, debt collectors. Now the debts had caught up. And they're not nice people, he added softly, leaning forward like we were conspiring. If he doesn't pay, they'll come looking for him. Then he named a number, large enough to make the air leave my lungs, almost half my savings. I blinked slowly. You're kidding. Gerald shook his head. Family helps family, Maisie. You've been off making good money, medals and all. He's had a rough time. I said nothing. He mistook silence for weakness and kept pressing. You're really going to turn your back on your brother, on your mother. That word, mother, was his weapon of choice. He used her like a human shield. If she finds out Ethan's in danger, he continued, the stress could kill her. You'd be responsible for that. Each word landed like a precision strike, hitting where I was softest. Loyalty, guilt, love. He was a strategist, one who understood emotional warfare better than any enemy I'd faced overseas. But he underestimated who I'd become. No, I said quietly. He froze, the mask slipped for just a heartbeat before reforming. What did you say? I said no, my money isn't for Ethan's mistakes. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then Gerald's eyes darkened. The mask shattered completely. His voice rose loud and raw. Don't you take that high-end mighty tone with me. You think wearing that uniform makes you better than us. The day you enlisted, I was the one paying off Ethan's debts so he wouldn't rot in jail. You owe this family. It was a lie, a desperate, clumsy one. And for the first time, I saw him for what he really was. Not a tyrant, not even a man to fear, just a small, bitter bully who'd built an empire out of intimidation. I met his fury with calm so absolute it scared even me. No, I repeated. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. He wanted me to yell, to cry, to give him a show he could twist into justification. Instead, I gave him nothing. And nothing is what terrifies people like Gerald most, silence that can't be controlled. He leaned forward until his face was inches from mine. You'll regret that, he whispered. Then he straightened, turned away, and muttered, Get out of my sight. I walked upstairs, each step deliberate, controlled. My heart was hammering, but my hands were steady. I'd learned long ago that fear loses power when you name it. In my room I packed, fast, clean, tactical, t-shirts, socks, uniform, pants, toothbrush, phone, charger. Essentials only. Travel light, move fast, that's how you survive. But when I looked at the door, another thought came, Mom. I couldn't leave her, not here. I found her sitting on the edge of her bed, hands twisted in her lap. The afternoon light cut across her face, revealing lines I hadn't noticed before. Lines carved by years of quiet endurance. Mom, I said softly, we have to go pack a bag. She looked up confused, afraid. Go where? Anywhere but here. We can stay with a friend, just please trust me. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady in the worst way. I can't. This is my home. Mom. I can't, Maisie. She shook her head again and again, each word breaking like glass. You don't understand. He'll find me. He'll find us. The truth hit like shrapnel. She wasn't just afraid of Gerald. She was tied to him, bound by invisible chains made of fear and history and habit. She didn't want rescue. She wanted permission to survive inside the cage. I knelt, took her hands. Then promise me you'll lock your door tonight. She nodded weakly. That was all she could give. Back in my room, I pulled out my phone and typed a message to the only person in this city I trusted, Robert Hayes. Need to get out of here. No anywhere safe. I hit send, slung my duffel over my shoulder and froze. Voices drifted up from the living room. Male voices, Gerald's and Ethan. My instincts took over. I moved quietly to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Ethan's voice was low, thick with whiskey. She said no. Can you believe that? No. Then Gerald's, calm, measured, more dangerous because of it. She doesn't see us as family anymore, son. She looks down on us. I felt the air leave my lungs. Silence. Then Ethan spoke again, a guttural snarl. She's been strutting around here like she's better than us, protecting strangers, ignoring her own blood. Another pause, so long I almost thought the conversation was over. Then Gerald said it, the words that would burn themselves into my memory forever. She doesn't respect us, son. Teach her a lesson. It wasn't loud, it wasn't emotional. It was clinical, almost casual, like ordering a pizza. And Ethan's reply chilled me to the bone. I understand, Dad. A lesson she'll never forget. For a heartbeat, everything went still. Then my training kicked in. Threat confirmed. Mission parameters changed. Immediate extraction required. My phone buzzed in my hand. A new message. Robert, come to my place. Now, doors unlocked. Relief and terror collided inside me. I had a destination but no time. I eased my door open. The house was dim, the glow from the TV flickering across the walls. My boots made no sound on the stairs. My heart beat slow and steady, each thump syncing with my breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Control. The living room came into view. They were both there, Gerald in his chair, Ethan on the couch, a beer dangling from his hand. Neither spoke. They just stared. Their silence felt like a verdict. I didn't meet their eyes. I just walked toward the front door. My fingers brushed the knob when I heard Gerald's voice behind me, soft, almost polite. Going somewhere. I didn't answer. The door creaked open and the humid night air hit me like freedom. I stepped through and didn't look back. The sky was ink black, the street empty except for the glow of a single convenience store sign 3 blocks away. I moved quickly, scanning corners, checking reflections in windows. Every sound, a car door, a rustling leaf, felt amplified. Paranoia and awareness often look the same when you've survived war. The automatic doors of the store slid open with a hiss, releasing a blast of cold, recycled air. The fluorescent light stabbed my eyes after the darkness outside. I grabbed a basket, moving through aisles mechanically. Bottled water, energy bars, first aid kit, fuel for escape. And then fate intervened again. Near the checkout counter, struggling to maneuver around a display, sat Robert Hayes. He looked up, surprised. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, smiling faintly. "Didn't expect to see you here." Relief loosened something in my chest. "You and me both." He gestured toward the counter. "Need a ride?" The doors hissed open again, and every hair on the back of my neck rose. "Ethan!" He stumbled in, 2 of his friends flanking him, drunk, swaggering, eyes red with rage. My pulse slowed the way it does before combat. He saw me instantly, and his lips twisted into that predator's grin. "Well, well, look what we have here, the hero and her crippled boyfriend." Robert stiffened but kept his voice calm. "Easy, son, no one wants trouble." "Shut up, old man," Ethan snapped, then turned on me. "You think you can walk out on us, after everything Dad did for you?" "Put the knife down," I said before he'd even reached for it. Because I'd already seen the tell, the twitch in his right shoulder, the flex of his hand. A flash of steel, the blade glinting under the lights. My body moved before my brain did, years of training collapsing into instinct. I stepped between him and Robert, turning my side to protect my core. The first strike came fast, aimed for my stomach. I blocked with my forearm. Pain exploded white-hot as the blade sliced through flesh. The second stab sank into my side. The air left my lungs. I pivoted, keeping Robert shielded, but the movement left my back open. The third and fourth came quick, shoulder, upper back, each thrust a shockwave of agony. Customers screamed. Someone dropped a phone. I shouted, "Call 911," but my voice barely sounded human. Fifth, sixth, seventh. My body was fire and ice, pain and instinct. I was bleeding everywhere, boots sliding on the linoleum slick with red. And then the eighth. He drove the knife straight into my abdomen with both hands. Rage and triumph mingled in one final brutal motion. Time slowed. The sound of the blade leaving my body was louder than the screaming. My knees buckled, the floor tilting, vision narrowing to a tunnel of light. Ethan's eyes went wide, not with remorse but confusion. He looked at the knife, then at me, as if realizing too late what he'd done. He dropped it, turned, ran. His friends followed. The doors hissed open one last time and they were gone. I hit the floor hard, cold, slick, fatting. Robert's voice cut through the static. "Stay with me, soldier, stay with me." His hands pressed against my wounds, but the blood kept coming. My hearing warped. The world sounded underwater. The fluorescent lights blurred into halos. The smell of iron filled my nose. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed. I wanted to tell him not to cry, that it was okay, that I'd seen worse, but my mouth wouldn't form words. My body felt weightless. Then the light went white and silent. Just before it swallowed me, I thought I heard my own heartbeat stop. What's the first thing you hear when you come back from the dead? For me, it was the sound of a heart monitor. Beep, beep, beep. Slow, steady, relentless. At first I thought it was rain, then a bird, then the faint hum of a generator in some base far away. My mind drifted between battlefields, memories, and nightmares, trying to find where I was, trying to anchor to something real. And then I heard it, someone crying, a woman's voice trembling, breaking, my mother. My eyes fluttered open. The ceiling was white, too bright, the kind of sterile light that doesn't belong anywhere near comfort. My mouth was dry. My throat felt like sandpaper. There was a tube taped near my nose, an IV line snaking into my arm. Every breath made my ribs ache. I tried to speak, but only a whisper came. "Mom." Her head snapped up. Her hands flew to her mouth. Tears spilled before she could stop them. "Maisie, oh baby, you're awake." Her voice cracked on every syllable. I wanted to reach for her, but my arms felt heavy, pinned by pain and fatigue. Her hand found mine, trembling. They said you might not wake up," she sobbed. 8 times, Maisie, 8 stab wounds. They didn't think you survived the blood loss." 8. The number echoed in my head like a curse. Images came back in flashes. The fluorescent lights, the knife, Robert's voice shouting my name, the siren screaming through the night. Then darkness, so much darkness. I swallowed hard. "Ethan." Her fingers stiffened around mine. For a long time she didn't speak. Then softly, "He's gone." "Gone," my voice rasped. "Where?" "They found him the next morning. Arrested him near the harbor, covered in blood. Said he was trying to get to Florida." I should have felt relief. Instead, there was only emptiness. "Robert?" I asked. Her face softened. "He saved your life. He's been here every day." That made something inside me break all over again, not from pain, but from the quiet kindness of it. I blinked through tears, whispering, "Tell him thank you." She nodded. "He's waiting outside. I'll get him." When she left, I stared at the ceiling, the hum of the machines syncing with my heartbeat. It was strange, how survival didn't feel like victory. I'd fought for years in other people's wars, and yet the battle that almost killed me had been right here at home. The door creaked open. A familiar figure stepped in, broad-shouldered, weathered, wearing that same faded Marine Corps cap. Robert Hayes. He stopped a few feet from the bed, eyes soft but haunted. "You look better than last week," he said, trying to smile. "That's not saying much." My lips curved weakly. "You shouldn't have seen that." He shook his head. "Shouldn't have left you alone, you mean?" There was a pause, the kind that carries more truth than words ever could. Then he moved closer, setting something on the table beside my bed. The thermos. The same one his wife had sent soup in. "You left this at my place," he said quietly. "Thought you might want it back." I stared at it for a long time, then whispered, "You saved me twice." He looked away. "Don't thank me, soldier. I just did what you did for me that day. You stepped in when no one else did. The world needs more of that. The monitor kept beeping steadily. The room smelled of antiseptic and rain, the kind of scent that makes you think of new beginnings, even when you don't believe in them. But beneath the calm there was a storm brewing. I could feel it. Because I knew Gerald wasn't done. 3 days later, the police came. Detective Madsen was the kind of man who carried weariness in his shoulders. His badge caught the sunlight, but his eyes were dark. He pulled a chair beside the bed, flipped open a small notepad and began, "Ms. Wright, I'm sorry to ask you questions in this condition, but we need your statement." I nodded faintly. "I'll tell you whatever you need." He scribbled something, then asked, "Can you confirm the attacker was your stepbrother, Ethan Carter?" "Yes." "Did you exchange words before the assault?" "Yes," I whispered. "He said he was teaching me a lesson." The pen paused. "Did anyone else encourage or instruct him to harm you?" I hesitated. This was the question that mattered, the one that could unravel everything. Gerald's voice played in my head, "Teach her a lesson." But so did my mother's, "Please, don't make him angry. Don't add fuel to the fire." If I said the truth, it would destroy her world. If I didn't, it might destroy mine. I swallowed hard. "Yes," I said finally, "my stepfather." Madsen looked up sharply. "Gerald Carter." I nodded. The room felt suddenly smaller. He told him to do it. He didn't ask for details. He just wrote it down slowly, deliberately, like he was etching the words into stone. Then he stood, closed his notebook, and said softly, "Thank you, Sergeant. That's enough for now." When he left, the air felt heavier, like I'd lit a fuse that couldn't be undone. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My body ached. My mind replayed the scene again and again, the way Ethan's eyes looked when the knife left his hand. Not remorse, not horror, just confusion, like he couldn't believe his rage had turned real. I didn't dream, I remembered. And when morning came, the light through the blinds looked colder. My mother sat beside the bed again, silent, her face pale, her eyes swollen. "You told them," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I said, "because it's the truth." Her lips trembled. "You don't understand what you've done." "Mom, he ordered my death." "He's still your father," she snapped, too fast, too loud, too broken. "No," I said softly, "he is." Her face crumpled. She pressed a hand to her mouth, sobbing quietly. "You've ruined everything," she whispered. "He'll go to prison." I wanted to tell her that was justice, that this was how healing began, but the words stuck in my throat, because deep down I knew she wasn't mourning him. She was mourning the illusion, the fragile fantasy that love could survive under fear. I turned my head away. "Mom," I said quietly, "one day you'll thank me for saving you too." But she didn't answer. She just stood, walked to the door, and left. 3 days later, the media found the story. "Decorated female veteran stabbed 8 times by stepbrother," the headlines read. "Family dispute turns violent. War hero survives brutal attack." They loved the surface-level drama. None of them cared about the rot beneath, the years of control, the silence, the kind of domestic tyranny that doesn't leave scars you can see. I turned off the TV. The sound of my name in the mouths of strangers made me sick. That evening, Detective Madsen came back. He carried a folder this time, thick with papers and photographs. "We arrested Gerald," he said simply. "Your statement helped." I stared at him. He confessed. He hesitated. He denied everything, claimed you were unstable, said Ethan acted on his own. Of course he did. Gerald's lies were as predictable as sunrise. Then Madsen said something I didn't expect. "But we found recordings, voicemails on Ethan's phone. He'd saved them. Messages from Gerald, enough to put him away for conspiracy and attempted murder." For the first time since waking up, I felt air fill my lungs without pain. "He's going to prison. Trial in 2 weeks. We'll need your testimony. I nodded slowly. I'll be there. He gave a small, almost admiring smile. You're tougher than most soldiers I've met. When he left, I sat there in silence. The heart monitor still kept time, steady and calm, but my thoughts weren't calm at all. Because justice, I realized, didn't feel the way I thought it would. It wasn't victory, it was mourning. Mourning for the years I'd lost to fear, to trying to be the peacemaker in a war that was never mine to fight. 2 weeks later, I sat in a courtroom. The air smelled of polish and paperwork. The walls were too white. Everything was too clean for the kind of mess that had brought us here. Gerald sat across from me, hands cuffed, suit pressed. His eyes found mine once, sharp and venomous, but I didn't flinch. The judge read the charges: conspiracy to commit assault, incitement, obstruction, emotional abuse. Ethan wasn't there. He'd taken a plea deal, 20 years. When it was my turn to speak, the room fell silent. My voice trembled at first, but the words came. I served my country because I believed in something bigger than myself. But the hardest battle I ever fought was inside my own home. Not against bombs or bullets, but against silence. The kind that makes you question your worth every single day. I paused, feeling every eye in the room. Justice isn't revenge, it's protection. Not just for me, but for anyone trapped in a place where love has become a weapon. When I finished, no one moved. Even the air seemed to listen. Then the judge nodded once, quietly, and turned to the defense. Gerald's lawyer whispered furiously in his ear. Gerald didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, jaw tight, eyes empty. The verdict came a week later. Guilty on all counts, 30 years. When they led him away, he didn't look back. Maybe because he finally knew what I'd known all along. There's no redemption without accountability. After the sentencing, I stood outside the courthouse with Robert beside me. The sky was overcast, the air damp with the promise of rain. He looked at me and said, "So what now?" I looked up at the gray clouds, the first drops of rain cooling my skin. "Now," I said softly, "I start learning how to live again." He smiled faintly. "That's the hardest mission of all." "Yeah," I whispered, "but at least it's mine." The rain came harder then, soft and steady, washing over everything. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like running. I just stood there, letting it cleanse what was left of the past. Later that night, back in my apartment, I sat by the window with the thermos in my hands. I unscrewed the lid, filled it with coffee this time, and watched the lights of the city flicker across the rain-slick streets. I thought about the word justice, how everyone wants it, but no one tells you how heavy it is when it finally arrives. It doesn't roar like thunder, it whispers, quiet, measured, ironic. Sometimes, justice doesn't even feel like winning. It feels like surviving long enough to remember who you were before the hurt. And as the rain fell and the city breathed around me, I whispered to the empty room. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Why does healing feel so much like combat? People think survival ends when the bleeding stops. They don't see the war that starts after, the one that happens quietly in the dark, when you're alone with your thoughts and the ghosts refuse to leave. It had been 3 months since the sentencing. 3 months since the courtroom lights, the rain, and the final click of handcuffs closing on Gerald's wrists. Charleston had shifted into summer by then, long, humid days that smelled of salt and rain-soaked magnolias. The city was alive, loud, colorful. But inside me, everything was still gray. The doctors called it recovery. I called it re-entry. Physical therapy became my new battlefield. My body moved like it belonged to someone else. Scar tissue pulled at my skin whenever I reached too far or turned too fast. The knife wounds had healed, but not gracefully. Lines of pale memory etched across my abdomen and back, a roadmap of what rage had tried to erase. Every morning I stood in front of the mirror and traced them with my fingertips. Not out of vanity, not even out of pain, but as proof. Proof that I'd survived what should have ended me. proof that my body, fragile as it felt, had refused to surrender. Push through the scar, my physical therapist would say. Breathe into the pain. Easy to say when the pain wasn't yours. The truth is, healing wasn't about muscle, it was about forgiveness. And forgiveness was the one thing I didn't know how to do. Robert Hayes became my constant. He came to therapy twice a week, not because I asked, but because he understood what silence can do to a soldier. He'd sit in the corner, coffee in hand, talking about everything except the night of the attack. Politics, the weather, his wife's garden, anything that wasn't pain. One afternoon, while I struggled through a new set of balance drills, he said something that stuck. "You ever notice," he murmured, "how everyone loves a survivor story, but no one sticks around for the part that comes after?" I paused mid-step, sweat dripping down my temple. "What part, that?" "The living," he said simply. "It's quieter, doesn't sell headlines." He wasn't wrong. After the cameras stopped showing up, after the neighbors stopped dropping casseroles at my door, there was just life. Ordinary, unremarkable, painfully empty life. And I didn't know what to do with it. Some nights I'd wake up gasping, convinced I was still on the floor of that store, the cold tile under my cheek, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. The knife flashed behind my eyelids. The voice, his voice, still echoed, "You think you're better than us." I'd sit up, drenched in sweat, heartbeat thundering, whispering into the dark, "It's over, it's over." But the mind doesn't obey orders that easily. Robert once told me trauma is like shrapnel. You can remove the big pieces, but the tiny fragments stay. They move with you, cut you when you least expect it. You learn to live around them. I was trying to learn. By July, my strength had returned enough to drive again. It felt like freedom, rolling down the window, wind on my face, sunlight spilling across the dash. But every time I passed the convenience store, my throat tightened. The world looked normal there. New paint, new windows, people laughing. You'd never know a war happened on that floor. I parked one afternoon against my better judgment and stepped out. The air was hot enough to shimmer. I walked slowly to the spot near the door where I had fallen. There was no stain, no mark, no sign, just clean tile, as if the past had been scrubbed away. But I remembered everything. The pain, the fear, the voice of a stranger telling me to hold on. A soft voice broke my thoughts. "Can I help you, ma'am?" It was the store clerk, a young woman, maybe 19. She smiled kindly, unaware. I forced a small nod. "Just visiting an old memory." She tilted her head, curious but respectful. "Good one or bad one?" I thought about that for a long moment. "Both," I said finally. She nodded like she understood more than she should have. "Well, whatever it was, you look like you won." I smiled faintly, though the word "won" didn't sit right. But maybe survival was its own kind of victory. As I drove away, the reflection in the rearview mirror caught my eye. I barely recognized her, the woman staring back. Not the soldier I'd been, not the victim either. Someone in between, someone rebuilding. Weeks passed. I began volunteering at the VA center downtown. Small things, helping veterans fill out paperwork, serving meals, sitting quietly with the ones who didn't want to talk. The building smelled of disinfectant and memories. The walls carried the weight of too many untold stories. One afternoon, a young Marine named Carter sat across from me, trembling hands clutching a folded paper. "They say I've got PTSD," he muttered. "They make it sound like a curse." I looked at him and saw myself, saw Robert, saw every soldier who came home with invisible wounds. "It's not a curse," I said softly. "It's proof you've seen too much and survived anyway." He stared at me for a long moment, then whispered, "How do you make it stop?" I hesitated, searching for truth, not comfort. "You don't," I said finally. "You just learn to make peace with the noise." He nodded, tears slipping down his cheeks, and for the first time in months I felt something shift inside me, a flicker of purpose. Maybe that was what healing really was, turning pain into something useful. That night, as I locked up the center, I saw Robert waiting by his truck, the streetlights painting silver in his gray hair. "Heard you're becoming the go-to counselor," he said with a small grin. I laughed quietly. "Guess I found my next mission." He nodded approvingly. "You're good at it. You've got that calm that scares the demons." "Is that what they call trauma now?" I said. "Same thing, different uniform." We stood there for a moment, neither of us needing to fill the silence. The cicadas hummed. The night air smelled like salt and freedom. Then he said something so gently it almost broke me. "You know, Maisie, surviving, only half the story. The other half's figuring out why." I looked at him. "And you ever figure out why you made it home?" He smiled faintly. "Still working on it, but helping you, that's a start." The months that followed blurred into a rhythm: therapy, volunteering, long drives by the coast. I learned to sleep again, though some nights the ghost still came. I learned to smile again, though sometimes it felt like muscle memory more than joy. And I learned to forgive myself, not for surviving but for hating that I did. One evening, I visited my mother. She lived in a small apartment now. The house had been sold. When she opened the door, she looked smaller, older, but her eyes softened when she saw me. "Maisie," she said quietly, "you look strong." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Inside, the air smelled of lavender and something homemade. On the table sat a photo frame, one I hadn't seen in years. Me, as a teenager in my first cadet uniform. Gerald wasn't in the picture. Neither was Ethan. For the first time, she'd chosen which memories to keep. We sat in silence for a while, sipping tea. Then she said, almost to herself, "I went to the prison." I froze. "Why?" "To see him, to tell him," she trailed off, eyes glistening. "To tell him I'm done being afraid." I exhaled slowly. "And what did he say?" "Nothing," she whispered. "He just stared at the wall, like a man who finally realized no one's listening." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached across the table, her hand shaking, and placed it over mine. "I'm sorry, Maisie, for all of it, for not protecting you when I should have." Tears blurred my vision before I could stop them. "You don't owe me an apology, Mom. We both survived the same war, just on different fronts." She smiled faintly, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I'm proud of you." It was the first time I'd ever heard her say those words. And just like that, something inside me finally unclenched. The years of silence, resentment, and pain, all of it began to dissolve in that tiny, fragile moment. That night as I drove home, the radio played softly, a slow, haunting song about forgiveness. The kind that fills the gaps between words. I rolled the window down, letting the wind wash over me. For once, the night didn't feel heavy. When I reached my apartment, I found a small package at the door. No return address. Inside, a polished wooden box. I opened it carefully. Inside lay a medal. My unit's insignia. And beneath it, a handwritten note. For courage beyond the battlefield. For reminding us that honor doesn't die in the dark. R. Hayes. I stared at it for a long time, the words blurring through tears I didn't expect. Not from sadness, from recognition. Maybe I'd never go back to who I was. Maybe I wasn't meant to. Maybe the point wasn't to return, but to rebuild. I placed the medal beside my thermos on the shelf. Two relics of survival. Two reminders that even in the worst moments, kindness can still find you. Outside, thunder rolled softly over the horizon. Rain began to fall again, the same kind that had poured on the day of the verdict. And for the first time, the sound didn't scare me. It sounded like renewal. As I stood there watching the storm wash the streets clean, one thought echoed in my mind, a whisper, calm and certain. Some wars are fought once. Others are fought every day. But the quiet victories, the ones no one writes about, those are the ones that save us. What happens when the past knocks, asking for mercy? It had been a year since the attack. 12 months of therapy, volunteering, and the slow rebuilding of a life I hadn't planned to survive. My scars had faded into pale silver lines. The nightmares had dulled, no longer nightly ambushes but distant echoes. But the mind has a way of circling back. And one morning the past came calling, with an official seal and a single word stamped across the top of the envelope: parole. I stared at it for a long time, coffee cooling in my hand. Parole for Ethan. They were asking for my testimony. They wanted to know whether I'd oppose his release. The letter said the usual things about rehabilitation, behavioral reports, remorse. But the part that stuck with me was this: the victim's statement carries significant weight in determining eligibility. Victim. I hated that word. It made it sound like I was frozen in that moment, bleeding on that cold floor, waiting for someone else to save me. I wasn't her anymore, but I could still feel her heartbeat sometimes, thudding beneath my scars. Robert came by that afternoon. I showed him the letter. He didn't say anything right away, just read it twice, jaw tight. Then softly, "You don't owe them anything, Maisie. You've already survived him once." "I know," I said quietly, "but maybe this isn't about him anymore." He looked at me for a long moment. "Then what is it about?" I didn't have the answer yet. Only the feeling, the strange, heavy pull that said maybe facing him was the last part of this long, unfinished war. At the VA center, the halls smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. The bulletin board was crowded with photos, soldiers smiling, some with prosthetic limbs, some with haunted eyes. I'd started leading small support groups for trauma survivors. Most of them were younger than me, carrying fresh wounds that hadn't even started to scar. That afternoon, we sat in a loose circle of folding chairs. The room hummed with quiet breathing and the low buzz of the AC. A new face joined us, a woman in her 20s, her uniform collar still sharp. She didn't speak at first, just listened. When it was her turn, she said something that silenced the room. "They told me to forgive the man who shot me," she said flatly. "Said it would help me heal. But every time I close my eyes, I still see his face. So tell me, what's forgiveness supposed to feel like?" The others shifted uncomfortably. No one had an answer. Except me. I leaned forward, elbows on my knees, voice quiet. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what they did. It's about remembering without letting it own you. Her eyes met mine, searching. "Do you believe that?" I hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'm trying to." She didn't smile, but something in her posture eased just a little. And I realized in that moment that maybe teaching was another kind of healing. Maybe you couldn't truly move on until you helped someone else do it too. After the session, I stood by the window, watching the late afternoon light slant across the floor. Robert's voice echoed in my mind. "You don't owe them anything." But maybe I owed myself closure. That night, I called Detective Madsen. The parole hearing was scheduled for September 4th. 1 year, 2 months, and 11 days since the night Ethan tried to kill me. The courtroom was smaller this time. No cameras, no reporters, just the parole board, a few officers, a legal representative, and me. I sat on one side of the room, Robert beside me like quiet armor. Across the aisle sat Ethan. He looked smaller, thinner. His once arrogant posture was gone. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame, the tattoos on his forearms faded. But the eyes, those were the same, too dark, too familiar. When the judge entered, everyone stood. My hands trembled, not from fear but from something heavier, the gravity of remembering. The hearing began. His lawyer spoke first about rehabilitation programs, clean record, genuine remorse. The words rolled off like water over glass. I'd heard rehearsed regret before. When it was my turn, the board chair nodded to me gently. "Ms. Wright, you have the floor." I rose slowly, steadying my breath. "I'm not here to ask for vengeance," I began. My voice sounded strange in that quiet room, firm but soft, like it belonged to someone braver than me. I came because I was asked if I could forgive the man who stabbed me 8 times, and I think the answer depends on what you mean by forgiveness. Ethan's eyes flickered up at me, uncertain. Forgiveness, I continued, isn't a door you walk through once and leave closed behind you. It's something you rebuild every day through pain, through memory, through choosing not to hate the person who tried to take everything from you. The room stayed utterly still. But forgiveness, I said, doesn't mean forgetting, it doesn't mean trust, and it sure as hell doesn't mean freedom from consequences. I looked directly at Ethan. You once told me I thought I was better than you. You were wrong. I didn't think I was better, I just wanted to be different. I wanted to break the cycle of cruelty we were raised in. But instead of learning from that, you let it own you. His jaw clenched, and for the first time his eyes dropped. Not from shame, from something smaller. Realization, maybe. I took a breath. So if you're asking whether I believe you've changed, I don't know. That's not for me to decide. But if you're asking whether I want you to walk free today, no. Because you haven't earned that peace yet. The board chair nodded once, scribbling something down. The hearing continued for another 20 minutes, but I barely heard the rest. My heartbeat filled the silence between every sentence. When it ended, Ethan was led away without looking back. I expected to feel relief. I didn't. What I felt was emptiness, like a wound finally closing but leaving behind a hollow where pain used to live. Outside, Robert was waiting by the courthouse steps. The sky was pale blue, the air heavy with the smell of wet asphalt after rain. "You did what you had to," he said softly. "Did I asked. He nodded. "Forgiveness isn't mercy, it's honesty, and you were honest." We stood there for a while, watching the clouds drift. Then, almost absently, he said, "You know, you've turned into one hell of a leader." I smiled faintly. "Funny, I never wanted to lead." "No one does," he said. "The right ones just end up doing it anyway." A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a veterans symposium in D.C. It wasn't something I ever imagined myself doing, standing behind a podium, lights in my face, strangers waiting for words I wasn't sure I had. But when I stepped onto that stage, a strange calm settled over me. The audience was filled with uniforms, men and women who'd seen things no one should have to explain. Survivors like me, some whole, some missing pieces, all still standing. I began the way I always did, with a question. "Do you know what courage sounds like?" The room was silent. It doesn't sound like shouting or gunfire. It doesn't sound like metals clinking or anthems playing. It sounds like breath steady, even after a night of nightmares. It sounds like someone whispering, "I'm still here." That's courage. As I spoke, I saw heads nodding, eyes glistening. And in that sea of faces, I saw reflection, people who had walked through fire and come out scarred but alive. I ended with something I hadn't planned to say. I used to think justice meant watching those who hurt us be punished. But I've learned it's not that simple. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming what they tried to steal: your dignity, your peace, your name. It's about learning to live again without fear. That's what survival means. When the applause came, it wasn't loud. It was gentle, real, the kind that comes from understanding, not spectacle. Afterward, an older woman approached me, her left sleeve pinned where her arm should have been. "You said what I couldn't," she whispered. "Thank you." I wanted to tell her I hadn't done anything special, that I was just trying to survive like everyone else. But then I realized maybe that was the point. Survival itself was something special. Quiet, unglamorous, sacred. Back in Charleston, the days grew shorter, the sunsets sharper. I spent more time by the coast, walking along the water where the horizon blurred between sea and sky. Sometimes Robert joined me, sometimes not. The silence was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I caught my reflection in the tide, the scars, the steady eyes, the faint smile. The woman who'd once been broken now looked whole. Not healed completely, but whole enough to keep going. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of salt and jasmine. I closed my eyes and whispered into it, not a prayer, not even words, just a quiet surrender. The kind that finally lets the world back in. When I opened my eyes, I thought about all the battles we fight that no one sees, the ones against memory, fear, and guilt. The ones that don't earn medals or headlines. The ones that shape us in silence. And I understood something simple, something I'd spent years trying to name. Survival isn't a finish line, it's a vow. A promise to keep walking, no matter what the past tries to whisper. That night, as the stars appeared one by one, I sat with my journal open and wrote. He once stabbed me 8 times to teach me a lesson. And maybe he did. He taught me that the strongest weapon a person can ever hold is peace. Why do the hardest battles begin after everyone stopped watching? They call you a hero, a survivor, a symbol. But when the speeches end and the lights fade, you go home to silence, to dishes in the sink, to the soft hum of the refrigerator and the whisper of your own heartbeat, proof that you're still here, even when you don't quite know why. That's what life looked like a year after the parole hearing. Quiet, uneventful, peaceful on the surface. I'd learned to enjoy small things again, the warmth of morning coffee, the sound of rain on the roof, the comfort of knowing the locks on my door were mine to control. The world, however, had other plans. It started with a phone call. Sergeant Wright. The voice was crisp, professional. This is Major Ellen Saunders with the Department of Veterans Affairs. We've been following your advocacy work. We'd like to invite you to speak at our annual Courage in Service conference in D.C. I hesitated. I'm not sure I'm the right person. With respect, ma'am, she said gently, you're exactly the right person. A month later, I found myself standing backstage at a massive conference hall, surrounded by banners that read courage, duty, healing. Rows of soldiers, officers, and civilians filled the seats. Cameras blinked quietly from the corners. Robert stood off to the side, hands in his pockets, giving me that same steady nod he always did before I went into something dangerous. You've got this, he said. I smiled faintly. You always say that. Because it's always true. When my name was announced, I stepped into the light. The room fell quiet, not out of reverence, but focus. The kind of silence soldiers give when they're listening for something real. I took a deep breath. The podium felt solid beneath my hands. Good morning, I began, voice steady though my heart raced. My name is Maisie Wright. I served 12 years in the U.S. Army Special Forces, but today I'm not here as a soldier. I'm here as something far more ordinary, a survivor. I paused, letting the words settle. A year ago, I learned that sometimes the war doesn't end when you come home. Sometimes it follows you through doors, through bloodlines, through silence. My battlefield wasn't a desert. It was my own house. A ripple of quiet shifted through the crowd. I used to think survival meant staying alive, I continued. But I've learned it's more than that. Survival is about reclaiming your story. It's about refusing to let the people who hurt you write your ending. I looked across the faces, soldiers, spouses, parents, some holding back tears. We don't get to choose what breaks us, but we get to choose what we build from the pieces. The applause was soft but powerful, rising like a wave. Not thunderous, human, real. Afterward, people came up to me one by one, veterans, nurses, social workers, each sharing their own scars, visible and invisible. One woman whispered, I lost my brother to suicide last year. Hearing you talk about survival like that, it made me feel like maybe I still can. I hugged her, no words, just understanding. By evening, the conference hall had emptied. I stood by the stage as the last light faded from the tall windows. Robert walked up quietly, his cap in his hand. You know, he said, if there's ever a hall of fame for the quiet kind of bravery, you'd be first ballot. I laughed softly. There's no hall for that. There should be, he said. A few weeks later, a letter arrived. It wasn't from the government this time. It was from Ethan. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. The handwriting was shaky, uneven. Inside, a single page. Maisie, I don't expect you to forgive me. I still don't fully understand why I did what I did. But in therapy, they said facing your own cruelty is part of the sentence. They asked me to write a letter to the person I hurt most. I wanted to hate you for being everything I was, but now I see what I really hated was myself. You didn't deserve what I did. None of you did. I don't know if I'll ever be free, but if peace is something a man can earn, I hope one day you'll let me try. Ethan. I folded the letter carefully, set it on the table, and just sat there, staring at it as the sun slipped lower through the blinds. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just breathed. Robert came by that evening and I handed him the letter without a word. He read it slowly, jaw working. You gonna write him back? I don't know. He nodded. You don't have to. I looked out the window. The sky was turning gold and violet. He said he wants peace. You think he means it? I thought about the way his eyes looked in that courtroom, not defiant, not proud, just lost. Maybe, I said quietly, but peace isn't something you ask for. It's something you build, every day, the hard way. Robert leaned against the counter, thoughtful. You think you'll ever forgive him? The question hung between us like smoke. Finally, I said, forgiveness isn't about him anymore. It's about me. And maybe forgiving means not letting that night on the rest of my life. He smiled faintly. Then I think you already started. Months passed. I kept working at the VA, helping veterans find jobs, housing, therapy. It became less about trauma and more about purpose. Every person who walked through those doors carried their own ghosts, their own silence, and somehow talking to them helped me keep mine quiet. But life has a way of testing peace the moment you start to believe in it. It was November when I got the call. My mother had fallen ill, pneumonia, late stage. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it was. The hallways smelled like antiseptic and memory. When I stepped into her room, she looked fragile, a thin figure under pale sheets, oxygen tubing tracing her face like glass threads. Her eyes opened when she heard my footsteps. Maisie, she whispered, voice thin but steady. You came. Of course I did. She smiled faintly. You always come, even after everything. I sat beside her, taking her hand carefully. How are you feeling? Like I've run out of time, she said softly. But that's all right, I made peace with it. Tears pricked my eyes. You don't have to talk like that. She squeezed my hand weakly. Listen to me, sweetheart. I saw what you became. You didn't let what they did break you. You turned it into something good. Promise me you'll keep doing that. I will, I whispered. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes clear, lucid, almost peaceful. You know, I used to think silence kept us safe, but you proved me wrong. Silence only protects the ones who cause harm. You gave us back our voice. Her breathing grew slower, softer. And with her final breath, she whispered, I'm proud of you. Those were the last words she ever said. The funeral was small, just me, Robert, a few neighbors, and a scattering of relatives who came more out of obligation than grief. I stood by her grave, hands clasped, the autumn wind tugging at my coat. The words on the stone were simple. Martha right. She found her voice in the end. After the service, Robert and I stayed behind. The cemetery was quiet except for the rustle of dry leaves. You think she finally found peace? He asked softly. I think she made it herself, I said. He nodded. That's where you get it from. We stood there in silence, the kind that doesn't feel heavy anymore, just honest. That evening, I went home and pulled out Ethan's letter again. I read it under the warm glow of a single lamp. The ink had faded slightly, the paper soft from being handled too many times. Then slowly I wrote back. Ethan, I don't know what peace means for you, but for me, it's not about erasing the past. It's about owning it and choosing what to carry forward. I don't hate you. I don't think I ever truly did. I hated what you became and how much I let it define me. But I've learned that hate is just another kind of chain. So if this letter finds you, know this, I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, because I do. Maisie. When I finished, I didn't feel lighter, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a long storm finally runs out of rain. I sealed the envelope, walked outside, and dropped it into the mailbox under a violet sky. The metal clanged softly, final and gentle all at once. For a long moment, I just stood there breathing the cool air, feeling the night settle around me. And I realized something simple, something my mother had tried to teach me long ago. Peace doesn't arrive with justice. It begins when you stop needing revenge to feel whole. That night before bed, I whispered a line I hadn't said in years, something my old unit used to recite before every mission. If we fall, we rise. It wasn't just a soldier's creed anymore. It was life. What does peace look like when you finally reach it? For some, it's a quiet porch at sunrise. For others, it's laughter echoing down hallways that once carried only silence. For me, peace looks like ordinary days. It's been 3 years now. 3 years since the night everything ended and began again. The scars on my skin have faded to pale whispers. The ones in my heart have softened into stories I can finally tell without breaking. The VA center runs smoothly these days. The halls are busier, brighter. Veterans come not just for help but for hope. On one wall, someone painted a mural last year, a soldier's silhouette rising from a storm, the words beneath it simple but true, "We still rise." It become a kind of motto, and somehow it's stuck. People still come to see me, some for advice, some for silence, some just to sit and drink the free coffee that tastes like cardboard but feels like home. I've learned that healing isn't about grand gestures. It's about small consistencies showing up again and again, even when it hurts. That's the thing about survival, it's not a finish line, it's a practice. One evening in spring, I was locking up the center when a young woman approached. Her hair was cropped short under a beanie, a service dog at her side. She hesitated before speaking. "Are you Sergeant Wright?" "I was," I said. "These days I'm just Maisie." She smiled faintly. "My name's Riley. I guess you could say I'm starting over." Her voice shook. She told me bits of her story: a car bomb in Kandahar, 6 months in recovery, panic attacks that left her gasping. "Everyone keeps telling me I'm lucky," she whispered. "But I don't feel lucky. I feel unfinished." I nodded slowly. "That's normal. You're not the person you were before, and that's okay." She looked up, eyes glassy. "How do you know it gets better?" I smiled softly. "Because you're still asking." Something in her broke open then, tears, quiet and raw. I put a hand on her shoulder and said the only truth that's ever helped me. Healing doesn't happen when you stop hurting. It happens when you start meaning it again. She didn't answer, but she didn't have to. She understood. As I watched her leave, the sunset spilled gold across the pavement, and I realized that's what legacy really is. Not statues, not medals, just being the person you needed when you were falling apart. A month later, an envelope arrived from the Federal Correctional Facility in Florida. "Ethan." My hands didn't shake this time when I opened it. The handwriting was steadier, the tone quiet, different. "Maisie, I got your letter. I read it every night for a week before I could write back. I don't know what to say except thank you. Not for forgiveness. I don't think I'll ever earn that, but for proving it's possible to face what we've done and still be human. I joined a literacy program here, started teaching other inmates how to read. It's strange. The same walls that used to feel like punishment now feel like structure. Maybe this is where I was always meant to learn who I was. I'll never undo what I did to you, but I'm learning how to stop being the man who did it. Ethan. I folded the letter slowly, tears blurring the ink. It wasn't absolution, but it was something closer, an echo of accountability. I didn't respond. Some words don't need to travel both ways. But I whispered into the air, maybe we both finally learned something. And for the first time in years, the name Ethan didn't taste like poison. That summer, the VA nominated me for a national award, the Medal of Civil Courage. When the letter came, I almost laughed. It felt strange, being recognized for something I never chose. At the ceremony, the hall was filled with uniforms and quiet pride. When they called my name, I walked to the stage with slow, measured steps, the sound of my boots echoing across marble. The medal felt cool in my hands, heavy, but not as heavy as it once might have been. The speaker's voice rang out, for bravery not on the battlefield but in the silence after, for standing up when the world turned away. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't prepare a speech. I just said what came. People think courage means not being afraid, I said. But that's not true. Courage is being afraid and standing anyway. It's waking up after nightmares, forgiving after betrayal, showing up after pain. I'm not a hero. I'm just living proof that survival isn't luck, it's choice. There was applause, but I barely heard it. I was looking at the faces in the crowd, ordinary, tired, beautiful faces that had seen war, seen loss, seen the quiet kind of endurance no one writes songs about. That's who I spoke for. Afterward, Robert met me outside under the glow of the streetlights. He grinned. Never thought I'd see you with another medal. I smiled. This one feels different. He chuckled, because you earned it the hard way. We stood there in comfortable silence for a while. Then he said something that stayed with me. You know, Maisie, people talk about justice like it's something courts decide. But sometimes justice is just becoming who you were supposed to be, no matter what they tried to make you. I looked at him, the streetlight glinting off his marine pin. Then I guess we both found ours. In the years that followed, my story traveled further than I ever expected. A journalist wrote an article titled "The Soldier Who Fought the War at Home." A documentary crew came by the VA. Colleges invited me to speak. At first, it felt strange exposing something so personal, but I learned that the more I told it, the less it hurt. Each retelling became less about me and more about the thousands of people still trapped in their own invisible battles. The women who still couldn't speak. The veterans who still thought silence was strength. The ones who needed proof that broken didn't mean useless. And so I kept telling it, not as a story of tragedy, but as a reminder that the human spirit, once cornered, can still rise like dawn. On the third anniversary of the attack, I returned to Charleston's waterfront at sunrise. The city was quiet, the sky awash of coral and pale gold. I sat on the same bench where Robert and I had once watched the ships move across the horizon. The wind carried the faint scent of salt and morning. My hands were wrapped around a thermos, the same one he'd given me all those years ago. The paint was chipped now, the metal dented, but it still held heat. In the distance, seagulls circled above the waves. The ocean whispered the same secret it always had: everything changes, and somehow everything endures. I closed my eyes and thought of all the people I'd met since then, the veterans, the survivors, the lost souls who came through my door and left a little lighter. I thought of my mother's last words, of Robert's quiet wisdom, of Ethan's letter. And I realized, maybe life isn't about moving on. Maybe it's about carrying forward gently. When I finally stood, the sun was breaking the horizon, gold spilling across the water, warm and new. I whispered into the wind, not for anyone in particular. For every woman who's ever been silenced, for every soldier who's ever come home with ghosts, And for every person who's ever been told they're too broken to matter, I'm still here. And so are you. The waves answered softly, like applause. I turned toward the city, the light on my face, and smiled. Because this time, dawn really did mean justice. Later that morning, I placed the thermos back on my shelf beside the medal and the folded flag from my service. 3 symbols of a life that hadn't gone as planned, and somehow, that was okay. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched sunlight fall across the floorboards. Outside, children's laughter drifted up from the park below. Ordinary sounds, beautiful in their normalcy. For years, I'd chased closure like a destination. But standing there in that golden quiet, I finally understood closure isn't something you find. It's something you create. One breath, one act, one morning at a time. And as I looked out at the brightening sky, I spoke the words that had carried me from blood to dawn. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.